everybody, welcome back to CMN 153, and this is for our class for Thursday, the 8th of August, where we are talking about journalism. But I also wanted to briefly talk about the journals. If you'll see in the notes below that the grading system of the journals, which was indicated in the syllabus, a plus is excellent, a check plus is very good, a check is satisfactory, check minus is less than satisfactory, minus unsatisfactory. So I should have returned the first two journals to you with your grade, so to speak, and also with some comments. I kind of think of it as a running commentary or a running dialogue. And certainly if you have difficulty reading my handwriting, which is quite possible, let me know. So basically, for the rest of the semester, we'll be doing an exchange of journals. And the idea behind the journals is that you can submit them in either with your discussion forum response or just the following class if it turns out that you wanted to read what people's discussion forum responses were and utilize that information in your journals. So you've already talked about the internet in your journals, and you've all approached it in very different ways. And you've already talked about newspapers and magazines. So now the next journal is going to be on journalism. But before I get into journalism, I wanted to remind you about the Media Education Foundation, which we had talked about a couple of classes ago when we were talking about research and how individuals will study media from an academic perspective. And I gave an example. It was just an example. Killing Us Softly Then and Now, which was a Smith College panel presentation in 2019. And I asked you to identify what you thought was the most interesting point. I thought I'd share with you what I think is the most interesting point. And it occurred at the ending of the presentation, where the panel discussion led to the idea that Jean Kilbourne had actually predicted Donald Trump's presidency in her scholarship before Donald Trump became president. And again, I encourage you to see Killing Us Softly Then and Now in its entirety. If you didn't have the opportunity to see it all, I know it's long, an hour and 33 minutes. Perhaps the best way to see it is in chunks, half hour or so. And for those of you who are interested in the documentaries that were discussed in that panel discussion, Killing Us Softly 4 and Tough Guys 2 are both available through the GCC library. And I've included links to both of those in the event you wanted to see them, not that you're required to. But now when we're talking about journalism, and we talked a little bit about this last class, it's probably not surprising to anybody that journalism has become extremist, it's become partisan, it's become opinion-based. That's actually known as the journalism of assertion. And in the 20th century, the attempt was to try to be neutral, was to try to be centrist, and certainly to focus on visuals with the advent of things like magazines and television. This was known as the journalism of verification. You might have heard of it as the idea of being objective, but it's impossible for anybody to be truly objective. Now, journalism has certainly changed since the 20th century, and there are many reasons why. Part of it is because of the diminished gatekeeping, as we talked about. The internet has basically taken over most, if not all, media industries, so that's led to the cuttings of staff, and staff were oftentimes employed as fact checkers and gatekeepers. Talk radio in the 1980s was particularly important in terms of delivering partisan politics that were opinion-based. You might have heard of the name of Rush Limbaugh. That was taken to an extreme with the 24/7 cable news cycle, which started in the 1990s, specifically Fox News. More on that later. And now, of course, we have internet citizen journalism, which means that in some ways we get information we never got before, but in other ways we don't know if any of that information is valid because there are no gatekeepers at all. Now, the idea of fake news, which is a term that's used very liberally in the 2020s, goes all the way back to the 1920s with the idea of a lying press. And oftentimes it was associated with politicians who didn't necessarily like the press coverage that they were getting. The press as we had talked about before, journalism being protected by the Constitution is often seen as a place for additional checks and balances of government. And there is a code of ethics that's associated with journalism to try to tell, or perhaps do more than try, to tell the truth. In other words, be accurate, be honest, be civil, be fair, and be source driven. To minimize harm, to be independent, to be accountable, and to be transparent. And of course, that flies in the face of much of the journalism that we are experiencing today. Now, fake news, in the truest sense of the term, is misleading by design. So this is deliberate. It's different than making an error in newscasting. And there's different kinds of fake news. Satirists, they use humor to critique. I think you might have heard me mention Jon Stewart in The Daily Show, that at one point it was considered to be the most trusted news source at the time, where news became entertainment and entertainment became news. Usually satirists are very obvious about what they're satirizing, but satire is difficult, especially if you're reading satire and you don't get tone of voice, because a lot of times you'll take seriously what is meant to be satire. So if anybody's ever read Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal, you know exactly what I'm talking about, which was written to indicate centuries ago that basically the best way to deal with poverty and many other social ills, such as domestic violence, would be to raise children, fatten them up, and serve them as food to society, and use the leftovers for the construction of clothing and other useful products. Now, this is a satire, but many introductory composition students will first read this essay by Jonathan Swift and think that it's serious. And the ending is what's so pivotal about this when we're asked the question, what is more cruel, to let people die of starvation on the streets or to treat babies well and ultimately use them for food? You know, so the idea is that this is supposed to be a satire that actually has some relevance to contemporary times. But you need to be careful with satire, again, because sometimes people will take it seriously. There are hoaxes and hucksters. These are the deliberate promotion of lies. You know, that I've seen a UFO or something of that nature, and that's not the case. There are, I love this term, opinion entrepreneurs. That sounds so nice, doesn't it? People who try to influence beliefs and viewpoints, which has specifically grown from talk radio and cable news to where we are now with the internet. Propagandists, these are usually governmental partisan messages. And information anarchists, individuals who deliberately create doubt and mistrust to make chaos and disorder in society. Now, on page 480 of the edition of the text that I had ordered for us, there's a checklist about how to determine if something is fake news. And there are lots of elements to consider, but I wanted to share just a few. Does the information seem accurate? Is it a non-exaggerating approach to the information? Are we given reporter bios so that we can research who wrote this and what their background is? What is the contact information of this news source so that we can reach out and get additional information? Are multiple sources being used so that they can fact check against one another? Are the quotes credible and also verifiable? Are there varying viewpoints? And who or what is the company ownership, and how might that play a role in the information that we're getting? But I wanted to make today's class short because there is a documentary I want you to see, and it is somewhat long, an hour and 17 minutes, and it is somewhat dated, but it is incredibly important. It came out in 2004, so we're talking about 20 years ago. It was called Outfoxed, and it was about the cable network news 24/7 news cycle, specifically with Fox News, only because Fox was the first, and they created a winning formula that ultimately was duplicated by everyone. So this isn't so much a criticism of the politics of Fox News, which happens to be conservative. This is more a criticism of how it changed the idea of journalism on a massive scale, that we no longer had journalism of verification, we had journalism of assertion. And back in 2004, it was less widely known that this was a journalism of assertion. People viewed Fox News as offering facts. And the question is, do any of these partisan approaches to news offer facts? And what they ended up doing with Fox News in some ways is kind of similar to what Gene Kilborn did with Images, except what they did was they took video clips from Fox News and compared them all and found all of the things that we are experiencing now in our journalistic age. So it was really a warning call at the time that unfortunately society did not heed, because it's only become worse rather than better. But if you're interested in the historical origins of things, and I think this is as much a history class as anything else, then understanding how we got to where we are now, I think will lead you to perhaps trying to figure out how we can change things for the better. So Outfox, that 2004 documentary, gotta love YouTube because it's there. And I've included the link, so I'm just basically going to let you watch that documentary, and that's going to be today's attendance question, which we'll be doing our class discussion forum on Thursday, the 7th. And certainly if you need additional time, let me know. And as you know, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are encouraged to respond to your peers. You are required to read your peers' responses and also my responses in turn. So after watching Outfox, your question is, what was one of the most interesting things you noted while watching Outfox? And why did you find it to be interesting? Again, no right or wrong answers. It's more of the debate and the conversation, I think, that's valuable, and trying to understand the differing perspectives that we might have. And again, this isn't necessarily a critique of a political agenda as much as it is an examination of how journalism has changed to opinion-based and partisan reporting. And I think I might have mentioned Rupert Murdoch to you, where we were talking a little bit about media moguls, and that Rupert Murdoch, an Australian, and this is directly related to the magazine section, was clever enough to buy the TV Guide when, in the 1980s, when there was basically few television options available, so that he could promote his own new television network because he owned TV Guide, and this is how information was spread about what was on TV. And his new network was Fox, and that led to ultimately Fox News. And he still has a hand in media, though I think that his name has been surpassed by people like Elon Musk, who are known for not only being very political, as Rupert Murdoch was, but also being very invested in media. So if you know anything about Elon Musk, then you know how he purchased Twitter and turned it into X, which is a major communication vehicle. So I'm curious to see what you have to say about Outfoxed, and we will continue on next class talking about, well, of course, media, as well as revisiting the idea of the final project. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and take care. Bye-bye.